of this crisis, and what are the implications for all of us, both here and beyond. Let me also start by observing to you that nobody has a monopoly on wisdom. And I think that's why these gatherings are very important, because it is the sharing of that wisdom amongst the community that allows everybody to perhaps gain a different perspective on their position. There's an awful lot of people in this room who are active participants in the economy, whether it's the real economy or the financial economy, and therefore there isn't anybody who isn't an expert in their own area. So let me start with my area, the whole phenomena of crises. The first thing to say about crises is, one, they're not new, two, they're consistent, and three, they'll come again. But like all crises, they will pass. And so the first lesson of a crisis is to understand that it's a storm which we must all pass through. Let me give you a few examples. Crises are not a recent phenomenon. For those who want to remember, 30, 40 years ago, in the 1970s, we had the Latin American debt crisis. In the 1980s, we had various corrections around commodities. In the 90s, we had the Asian crisis, Brazil, Russia, Mexico. And more recently, we had specific financial events around organizations. Some of the financial connoisseurs will know LTCM in the United States about a decade or so ago. So crises have been a fairly frequent feature of the landscape. But actually, the crisis we're in today is probably the most pronounced crisis that the world has seen on a global basis since the 1930s. What's different about this one? Well, what's different about this one is it probably is the largest global crisis we have seen, that it's wider than a single continent, it's wider than a single instrument, and it's wider in its broadest context, in the sense that it affects everybody, from those in the finance industry to those in the real economy. So it has far-reaching impacts. One of the reasons it's global, very simply, is because if you think about what's been going on in the last 20 years in the world has been preaching very actively that actually globalization is good. The ability to trade, the ability to invest, the ability to cross borders easily is a very good thing. Now, in many ways, it was a very good thing. Liberalization led to an unprecedented period of economic growth. And that growth stimulated jobs, it stimulated investment, it stimulated opportunities. But actually, we forgot one thing. Life is a series of cycles. No good thing lasts forever, and no bad thing lasts forever either. So it's inevitable a correction is going to come. But people forget, and that forgetfulness manifests itself in many different shapes and forms. And one of the sources of this crisis is something called liquidity. To all of us, known as our savings and our investments, but it's a pool of capital that is created in one place and exported in another. The origins of this crisis lie really in the fact that many of the economies here in the Middle East and in Asia saved money. And when they saved money, they had to deploy money. So where did they deploy it? They couldn't necessarily deploy it all in their home markets. So they sought opportunities overseas. Where were those opportunities? The opportunities overseas in the world's greatest economy, 60% of GDP worldwide, is the United States of America. And the largest available pool of investment into that economy was the housing market. So, in very simplistic terms, you had savings being accumulated in Eastern economies and being exported and being put into Western economies, which provided yield or a return on those investments. Now that was all well and good as long as the underlying investments kept rising. But the trouble was that actually this liquidity went into the housing market, inflating the underlying assets and creating an asset bubble. So in effect, you created a bubble that you were feeding all the time with more and more money coming into this bubble. And there was also more and more sophistication in the financial markets. Warren Buffett famously described derivatives as weapons of financial mass destruction. And how right he was. Because in effect, sophistication upon sophistication meant that the money went into financial instruments which were far removed from the underlying assets, which were housing. And so a huge bubble was created in the United States. What happened in the United States in 2006, something called subprime broke. What was subprime? Well, subprime was basically mortgage-based lending to people who were below prime status. So people who couldn't necessarily command mortgages regularly through applying from banks, building societies, savings and loans associations, were the recipients of large amounts of capital. And in 2006, it became very clear that there was a problem coming. Very simply, those people couldn't afford to pay. And that started the beginnings of a crisis which in 2007 became visible. So the top of the iceberg suddenly came out of the ocean, and people began to see that many of these assets were going to be problematic. So who were the providers of these assets? Who were the providers of these loans? Well, these were predominantly financial institutions. And these financial institutions, as they are required to, under their laws of governance, under their accounting laws, had to start providing against these loans or these assets which were increasingly deteriorating in quality. And that meant that the capital that they had in their businesses was beginning to be threatened. So every time a problem came up, they were required legally and under accounting convention to provide and then to write off these assets. This is the equivalent of a snowball going downhill, because it just picked up more and more momentum. And the reality was more and more financial institutions became caught up in this problem. Not only those in the United States, but also those who from foreign afield had invested in those assets. So you didn't have to effectively be a direct lender, but you could have invested in assets that were sold to you by institutions who were direct lenders. So in effect, that the contamination that this created, or contagion as it's more fashionably called, created a sense of assets having depreciating values and capital being under pressure. And many of these institutions began to fail. The manifestations of this were seen originally through institutions, for example, in the United Kingdom, and those of you who are familiar with the United Kingdom, Northern Rock as a building society, which couldn't raise money to fund itself anymore because those who provided it money no longer wanted to take a risk on Northern Rock. So we had the law of dominoes. One institution began to fall, and then another institution began to fall, and soon the financial system, or the stability of the financial system, became under threat. That's something that the world had not seen previously. It hadn't seen it previously because where problems had happened previously, they had happened domestically, or they had happened within a certain boundary. Now what was happening was a problem in the States, or a problem in Europe, or a problem in Asia, now had everybody impacted by that. And so the underlying financial system around the world and how it was governed became under threat. Many institutions were the subject of takeovers. Some institutions became the subject of government-orchestrated marriages. So, for those familiar